This is the first of several lecture segments devoted to HTML and CSS. These are not programming topics, but they, along with the HTML DOM, are the technology that underlie any browser-side UI library like jQuery, so they need to be understood as fundamentals. This topic, and the next on DOM, will build a simple tabbed page UI control using HTML. The example is shown here in the diagram. For this topic, it's a static display. The next topic will add live response to the tabs being clicked. At the current point, for instance, you can see tab 2 has been clicked, but we set that up statically. Now, before we go through our example and some review exercises, let's have a word or two on how to approach these two topics. First of all, you're probably already familiar with HTML and perhaps with some CSS. And if you are, you may have noted that they are rather hacked up designs. Having evolved from original HTML, a simple document layout protocol, into a system for detailed browser UIs with tools for artistic layout as well as programmatic event handling and UI control. The evolution of HTML and CSS appears to have been guided by an X is cool, so let's slap on a feature for X approach. Better designed UI systems define a few larger concepts that can be used in varying combinations to accomplish whatever is desired, but HTML and CSS are more of the bag of tricks variety. For instance, they lack any simple standard way to define nested patterns of vertical and horizontal layouts, often called box layouts in other systems. Instead, they rely on a hodgepodge of float and position properties that can be remarkably idiosyncratic, as we'll see as we design this example tab control here. Here's a brief look at the kind of configuration that's necessary to get those tabs and the pages underneath them organized properly. The HTML down here. Again, we'll explain all that as we go along. Now, there is some movement toward fixing this, especially in HTML5, which, for instance, includes some prototype style features for box layout. But for the time being, you have to live with a design that is more characteristic of artists, really, than engineers. Now, one of the side effects of patch on another feature design is that it spawns huge sets of specific subfeatures that are nearly impossible to remember. For instance, as you can see in the transcript here, the style selector p:/only -child space a:/visited picks only A tags, HTML to A tags, that have been visited and are within paragraphs that are the only child of their parent tag. Now, don't go memorizing that. CSS in particular is full of this sort of small or petty detail, and the correct learning approach is not to try to absorb all the details, but to get the large picture and the big concepts and know where to look things up. And, just to add to the fun, each browser has subtle variations in its implementation of HTML and CSS. For instance, it takes special effort to make a parent div tag, HTML div tag, enclose its children graphically, so that its background color, for instance, will show underneath the display of all its child tags. The parent-child relationships between tags does not automatically imply graphical nesting, by the way. It's a more CSS hack up there. And there's a style attribute, overflow hidden, that normally accomplishes this, but not in all versions of IE. And predictably, a lot of the variation is in IE, especially older versions of it. Now, much of this is masked by libraries like jQuery, which automatically adjust their use of HTML and CSS features based on the browser version. Rather than wade into browser version details, we'll consistently use one browser in these lectures, Chrome. And get a copy of it if you don't already have one. Firefox users, apologies, your browser is pretty good too. IE users, here's a nickel, kid. Get yourself a real browser. Whichever browser you may be used to working with, please get a copy of Chrome for purposes of this lecture. Now, the one saving grace of HTML and CSS is the ease with which you can try out alternatives. It's even easier to adjust an HTML CSS page and reload it in a browser than it is to tweak and rerun a JS script. And this is how most HTML CSS design is done, incrementally with repeated tests, and it's how we'll explore HTML and CSS in these lectures. We're going to gradually build this example tab block here, a step at a time, and explore features as we go. Now, every browser comes with some sort of tool that shows a breakdown of the HTML tags, which come in a tree form, in fact, within the current web page, as well as details on the CSS styles that apply to each tag. In Chrome, this is obtained via Control-Shift-I, thus. And as you explore HTML and CSS, you want to use this tool. Now, as mentioned, you're expected to already know HTML basics, including tags or elements, and in particular the tags as listed in the transcript, A, BR, body, div, head, HTML, any of the H numbered tags, H1, H2, H3, I, image, table, TD, THTR, title, LI, OL, UL, P, and span, and the attributes ID, href, class, and style. If you don't already know these, that's okay. You're not going to find it too hard to learn them if you are a programmer. Just use the bibliography references to brush up on these, or learn them for the first time before proceeding. And build a small web page or two using them if you've never before written a web page. I'd rely mostly on the MDN references from the bibliography, but the W3 Schools reference is also fun, especially for its Try It Out tool. So use those two in whatever balance you find is most useful for you to at least set up a basic web page that uses a good number of the HTML tags and attributes I just showed you there, or just mentioned in the transcript. And of course, predictably, I'm going to drop a few in-lecture questions here. And now, these are mostly just reality checks to see if you've had a chance to either review or explore for the first time a bit of basic HTML. And be sure that you've done that before you try these questions. It may have been a bit of a wait. That's okay. Question 1. Summarize briefly the commonalities and the differences between the div and span tags. And what do they look like in a display? Can they be nested within one another? And the answer there is they're both elements for grouping other HTML elements. Their appearance is thus determined by their child elements. But div may contain just about any internal content, including many lines of layout, while span contains something called phrasing content, which is just paragraphs and text and hyperlinks and so forth. And span content is laid out horizontally, while div content flows roughly vertically. So a div may contain a span, but not vice versa. And then question 2. What do the elements font and center and the attributes width, color, border, and height all have in common? There's something about all of those collectively that is worth noting. The answer is they're all either entirely or partially made obsolete by the CSS style system. There are style properties for font, for text alignment, for color, and border that are more powerful than the old tags and attributes and are preferred. One of the biggest evolutions in HTML has been moving away from a limited set of tags and attributes to describe appearances like color and font, and toward this separate style description system, CSS, which we'll look at next year. So a bit of CSS overview. In the early web days, the limited appearance description of HTML was sufficient. Even the blink tag was popular for a mercifully brief time. As pages grew more artistic and complex, several things became apparent. First, more fine control was needed over fonts and borders, spacing, color, relative positioning of elements, etc. Second, there had to be some way to adjust a font, color, and so forth without hand tweaking the attributes on every affected HTML tag in every affected page. And then 3, the people who did artistic layout were not programmers, and they needed their own simpler language for describing aesthetic decisions. The result was CSS, cascading style sheets. As with HTML, you are expected to do some background review reading, since much of CSS is simple to understand. As you do, using the bibliography materials again, be sure you get these major concepts at least roughly in mind before we get into deeper detail. First, the concept of style properties and values. These are the basic elements of CSS. Let me pop up some of the CSS for our tab control so we have a few properties and values to look at. It's this sort of thing I'm talking about here and here. There are hundreds of different fine details on borders and colors, fonts, spacing, etc., and they're each given a property name. The CSS language lets you describe values for each using various formats. Don't try to memorize them all, but get some good examples and know where to look them up. We'll do a lot of detailed discussion of the ones here during the walkthrough. Second big idea is blocks, rule sets, and selectors. Property value pairs are grouped into blocks, and each block applies to selected HTML elements based on the element's tag type or on their ID and class attributes. So you can apply a given font and color rule, for instance, to all P elements, all paragraph elements, for instance, or all elements with a certain class attribute, or to elements with a specific ID attribute. These rules of attachment are determined by the rule sets ahead of each style block. And the rule sets themselves are composed of individual selectors. These are relatively simple ones, so they have one selector each. This one, for instance, here, .tab block, is saying that any block of HTML or any, HTML tag that has tab block as its class property, its style class, will have these rules for style associated with it. This one here with the pound sign indicates instead that the HTML tag with ID block 1 will have this rule associated with it, and so on. And the third major idea to get a feel for is the various ways by which you can attach CSS rules to an HTML page. This includes things like .css include files, or the inline style elements, as our current example has here. All this is in a big style element. Also, the class attributes and style attributes for each HTML element. There are several places you can put CSS blocks, ranging from those separate include files all the way down to on-the-fly declarations via the style attribute of an HTML element. And again, the review material should give you a feel for that. And then 4, the general idea that appearance includes layout. CSS governs not only colors, fonts, and the like, but also the positioning of elements relative to one another. Be sure to take a look at the concepts of layout, mode, and the float, position, and clear properties. So, with those 4 big ideas in mind, read the bibliography materials with an eye to getting an overview picture of CSS. Again, don't try to understand everything right off. We'll be doing a detailed case study in the next segment. But please do try to answer at least these questions. First, to what HTML elements would a style block that had a rule set a.big pound first, separated by commas as in the transcript, to what elements would that apply? Pause and think about that for a minute. Again, based on your review reading. It would apply to all A-tagged elements, all hyperlinks, and also to all elements with a class attribute that included big, and also to the element with ID first. And there's an example, by the way, of a rule set that includes several selectors, 3 selectors in particular. And question 4 here. If an element has a style attribute position : relative, to what position is its location going to be relative? And what would such a style attribute do if it was accompanied by, for instance, a top : 8px style attribute? Again, I'm expecting you may be kind of diving back into your review here and looking in a little more detail at those particular things. That's all I'm really seeking for you to do at this point. It's relative to where it would normally be in the layout, not relative to some other element. So position relative is good for tweaking the location of an element a bit. And the added top : 8px would tweak it down 8 pixels from its otherwise default position.